All right, welcome everyone to Andrew's final project 101. If you guys will open your textbooks and turn to page 237, we will get started. Now, the theme I chose for my final project is the theme of the afterlife, life after death. Now, the reason I chose this topic is because that the whole idea of the afterlife, if you go through history, cultures have been obsessed with this idea of what life is like when we die, the life after death. No matter who you are, you've always wondered what it's going to be like when your time is up here on earth. Even Christians, we know that we're going to heaven, but we don't know what it'll be like in heaven. The Bible gives us some examples, like the length and width of the city, and some other stuff, like the streets will be paved with gold, probably the tree of life. But those are just some of the details. We don't know what it's going to be like. We don't even know if we'll have wings or not when we get to heaven. I hope we have wings. This question it's driven some people crazy, I'm sure. Not only that, but it dictates everyone's life. Whatever you believe, no matter what you believe, whatever it is that you believe about the afterlife, it shows in the life that you live. It dictates how you live. People who don't believe that there's a life after death, or that they believe there's going to turn into a tree or something, like, they're not going to, they live for worldly pleasures, and they just try to store up as much riches and have as much of a good time as they can before their time is up. And there's other people, like the caste system, who will try to do good deeds all their life, so that when they get born in the next life, they can move up the ladder. And then us as Christians, we believe in a heaven, and we know that when we die, we'll have to answer for everything that we've done, and we'll be in heaven, and each will be given to what he is owed. And so we've always been taught to store up riches in heaven and doing good deeds all our lives. So this whole idea of the afterlife, this concept, it has brought people together from all nationalities and skin colors. It's unified countries. But it has also destroyed countries, people, families. It's torn them apart. All because people disagreed about this idea of the afterlife. If someone thought one thing and then someone who thought the opposite came along, that disagreement can cause hatred, and it's led to bloodshed in the past. So it's a very important idea, concept, that humans, we wanted to be able to share our curiosity and express it in ways that others could comprehend and try and get the same feeling out of what we were feeling ourselves. And that came about in a visual form, in art. People were able to use art to paint or sculpt, and all the other different methods on art, in trying to just answer this question, or at least give their own representation of what they think it's like. And we want to be able to share that with others. And how people did this, we can follow it through all of the art movements on what people believed about the afterlife, and also how important it was to them, if it wasn't important, if it was. And I think it's just really cool that we can see how different people of different cultures and generations and time periods, how they all felt about this concept. So we'll go ahead and get started with prehistoric art. So, prehistoric art. Prehistoric art, also known as Neolithic art, it includes everything pretty much the beginning of time until around 500 BCE. But because it's such a broad time period, I'm going to be focusing on the Stone Age for the most part. The Stone Age goes from about, again, the beginning of time until about 4000 BCE, which is right before the Mesopotamian Age. The earliest art that we have on record dates to around 30,000 years ago. They're not 30,000 BCE. So, Stone Age. Stone Age was characterized by cave paintings. It's probably the most familiar one. There's also portable figurines such as the Venus figures. Venus figurines. Oh, and the cave painting, the Megara Cave is a great one that I really like. And also is characterized by rock formations, which we have the classic example of Stonehenge that we all know. So, in the Stone Age, judging from the art that we have left from them, from the cave paintings and such, the spirituality was a big part of their culture. It was important in hunting gathering societies as it came to hunting. Almost all cave paintings are of either before the hunt, after the hunt, during the hunt, preparing for the hunt, doing rituals to get ready for the hunt. So, alright. So, yes. Now, you may be wondering, how does this relate to the afterlife? Because I did say that the theme was about the afterlife. In cave paintings and figurines, there's a lot of detail that was given to creatures that were viewed as powerful, strong and powerful. I feel like, judging from how much more detail they put into these, that it was maybe they're more revered, and perhaps they felt that these animals, that if they conquered them during a hunt, in the next life they might be blessed, be stronger. Likewise, if maybe that from worshiping or praising these creatures that were stronger, seen as strong, powerful, like lions and bears and such. They also could have felt that perhaps they'd be blessed in the next life with additional strength. Yes. So, that is Stone Age. So moving on from the prehistoric movement, we get to the Antiquities movement, which began in Egypt sometime around 1500 BCE and ends in the classical world around 500 CE. Personally, I love the Antiquities. The Antiquities, and not just all the Antiquities. But the reason I like the Antiquities so much is that this is like when art starts to explode in abundance. So everything started to evolve from just like stick figures on walls and little rocks that kind of look like people. So my most specifically is the Egyptian art. I really like Egyptian art. That is probably my favorite art period of time, is the Egyptian art, and a lot of it goes back to the Bible stories about Egypt that I learned as a child, and I was always fascinated by it because those stories about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. just those are my favorite Bible stories. I mean, crucifixion of Christ is a good one too, I guess. Moving on, in Egypt, people began to take cave painting to a whole new level. So it wasn't just like these stick people. Now it was like stories that were written on walls. An example of this is the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which contained the names of wealthy Egyptians who essentially purchased their way, or purchased a guide to help them through the underworld. And Aker, the Egyptian god, was the gatekeeper of the underworld, and he was in charge of monitoring traffic basically through the underworld. And there were a lot of paintings and figurines made of lots of different Egyptian gods. And just looking at that in the art, it's pretty evident that the afterlife was like really big concern for the Egyptian people, because everything they did was in preparation for the underworld. There were pharaohs, pharaohs and even people in general. They felt that if you stored up your riches here, they would go with you into the next life. And so there's stories about pharaohs being buried with like 40 virgins or slaves to help them when they awaken the next life, and they can serve them there. So that's where you get a lot of the pyramids that are filled with treasure, because they thought that would go with them into the next world. And so, yes. So through the art, we can see how deeply religious the people of Egypt were, and how concerned they were about what's going to happen to them in the next life. And I love it. Now, I'll mention this. There is also the classical world with like the Greek art and the Roman art. Yes, I don't really like that art so much because it's mainstream. Yes, so I do enjoy it, but I'm going to stick with focusing on Egyptian art for this part. So, Antiquities movement. Alright, so after the Antiquities movement, we get to around, so from 500 CE to 1400 CE, we have this period. It's called the medieval movement, medieval era, also known as the early Renaissance. So, how do I put this? This period of art is probably my least favorite art movement ever. It's medieval art and the Dark Age. So art during this time was really bland, with 2D drawings of people, and the people that were drawn, they didn't even have emotions on their faces, or if they did, it'd be like a slight smile. So the art was pretty boring. So not only did medieval art just draw 2D people without expressions on their faces, but there was no perspective in the art whatsoever. And just, for example, just to make someone look more important, they just drew them bigger. And, yeah, okay. I'll leave that there. Alright, so although I may not like this art movement very much, this art movement has very much to do with our theme of the afterlife. And, well, almost all art during this period was either portraits of significant figures in Christianity, such as the Peter or the Pope or Jesus, Mary Magdalene, all of the whole gang. So people thought that during this period, yes. So the whole culture was very religious. pretty much lived, breathed, and died a Christian, at least in Europe. And this whole, the whole process of living, people didn't really live. They kind of just were waiting for the next life. In the next life, that's when it's going to be better. So they like to paint all these different depictions of Jesus coming back and such. And these heavy, solely religious elements that consume the art world during this time. We have the Badia Politic by Guido di Bondone, and we also have the Maesta of Santa Trinita by Cimabue. So, those are a couple examples that I found. Yeah, alright, that's all I have to say about medieval art period. Okay, wait, hold on. Alright, so, the next art period, movement, we have the Renaissance / post-Renaissance / late Renaissance. This is late Renaissance. So, the Renaissance came about after this Dark Ages as a retaliation or explosion of like creativity that had been like welled up in the people for a long time. After a long period of depression, death, despair, caused by a very long war between England and France, and epidemics spreading like the Black Plague, and during which people lost hope and felt that life had to be hard and there was nothing more than work and war until you died and went to heaven. So again, that same waiting for the afterlife. Alright, so the art of Renaissance was not only a revival of classical Greek and Roman artistic styles and ideas, but art began to place an emphasis more on self-worth, and it kind of drifted away from the church a lot more than it used to. And it was based on ideas of self-worth, man-controlled destiny, and it wasn't fate or God. It shows in the art this separation from the church, as the last few hundred years were dominated by this international Gothic culture where only religious art was painted. Sorry. So, in the art, it feels like it's more about the individual, like that self-worth that we talked about. It's more about the individual, and it uses classic Greek and Roman styles, but not stereotypical people. It leaned more towards the Roman side in that they valued drawing real people with real, like in real situations and kind of realistic details that they kept to. So we ended up with a lot of portraits from this period. And just a couple, we have the Saint Sebastian by Raffaello Urbino, and then we have the Flora by Titian. Those are just a couple of the many portraits that we have from this period. Now, although I did say that we drifted, or the Renaissance kind of drifted away from the church was still a pretty big powerhouse. They still had a lot of power at this time. And there was definitely still significance in religion, and through religion, the afterlife. And because it was mostly Catholic Christian at this time, it was people believed a lot in heaven and hell. And okay, so definitely still significant importance placed on the afterlife and heaven and hell. An example of this would be we have the Garden of Earthly Delights, and then just a couple other ones so you can kind of understand. We have The Descent of Christ into Limbo by Agnolo Bronzino, and also Jacob's Dream by Giorgio Vasari. So those are a couple. So, and although not as many paintings about Christian elements were made, it was still pretty prevalent and reinforced that many still believe in the Christian version of the afterlife, as the church still retain a lot of their power. So, and make sure I don't steal my own thunder here. Okay. All right. So I'll talk about it in a second. All right. Yeah. So, Renaissance. The afterlife was. It's still there. It's still mostly around Christian elements at this time. So, all right. Moving on. All right. So, we get into the post-Renaissance era, and so the biggest one that I feel that I really liked was the Baroque period, and that's from about 17th century till the mid 18th century. So I'll briefly talk about it. It occurred right after the Renaissance, the Baroque period. We don't have too much to talk about besides changes in artistic style. The spiritual afterlife concern side of Baroque is very similar to the Renaissance, but it does have its differences. Baroque reflected the religious tensions of the age, the desire of the Catholic Church to reassert itself in the wake of the Protestant movement. I was going to say Protestant, that didn't sound right. So much like the Catholic Counter-Reformation art. So what I like about this area is that the Catholic Church, or the artists for the Catholic Church, in order to be able to reassert this, reassert the church back into a place of importance among people, they had to explore new creative ideas to represent the Catholic Church with lots of public displays of art. Now, these public displays of art included like huge wall monuments that were made. There's statues that were made, and my favorite personally was the frescoes that they made. It'd be on the ceilings of churches and such. Alright. So, so ceilings of palaces and vaults containing the Catholic dogma. Sometimes this was in biblical form, and sometimes it was in allegorical compositions. So for me personally, what I got from this, from some of my favorite ones, there's the Gesu ceiling that was painted by Agostino Ciampelli, and there's also the ceiling of the Ljubljana Cathedral by Giulio Quaglio. Just if you look at these frescoes that they made, like you see all the elements, like from like the beginning to the end, like the afterlife, like before the afterlife, life. So the afterlife was, again, it hadn't really changed much from the Renaissance. It was more focused on realistic forms of God. So God and angels and such, they were depicted more realistically, but but still having like wings and not superpowers, but you know what I mean. Now, on the church's side of things, I felt like these attempts at reassertion, they seem to be more for a gain of power than for than being concerned with the afterlife for a lot of the people at the time. So, yeah. Alright. So, now we get to the age of the isms. The 19th century. Neoclassicism, Romanticism, Realism, Impressionism, and lots of other isms. But because this is a very broad movement, I'm going to be focusing on the Romanticism, because that one, Romanticism for me is like, it's like opening up a present on Christmas Day. So I really like it because of the way it reminds me, it has like a biblical allegory to it, I feel. And it reminds me of not following the crowd, which in turn reminds me of like we as Christians need to stand out in the world and not follow what other people are doing just because, everyone's doing it. So Romanticism, like I just kind of alluded to, was basically like going against the flow of what had happened around them. So it was Romanticism, was a revolt against technical standards that perfection should be attained in art, an idea that resided from the classical ideals. So if we look back at Greek and Roman, more Greek art. If you look back at Greek art, we have like the perfect bodies of Michelangelo and all the different sculptures that were supposed to be like these athletic people that were like perfect compositions and stuff. So perfection, they didn't feel should be attained in art. Romanticism instead focused on the more personal, irrational, spontaneous, and emotional within art. It was also a revolt against tradition in general, such as established social order and religion. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. So a lot of the art feels experimental sometimes, and it's sometimes out of place for the time period, because that's essentially what it was trying to do. It was trying to stand out. That was its goal. Some of what was different about this movement was that through the art we began to see a drifting from religious and Christian ideas to the worship of nature, a love of poetry, and as well a distrust of science. So for Romantists, I think that's how you say it, life after death wasn't, they still thought about it. There's a couple paintings. I wasn't able to find much on it, but they weren't quite focused on that only because people had been so focused on it in the past that they thought it was less important. They thought they needed to change how we live right now and worry about the afterlife later. So it was not really important to the Romanticist artists as it had been to people in the past, because the religion was viewed as part of tradition that they were trying to separate themselves from. And so they didn't focus on the concepts like afterlife, though people generally during this time still held on to Christian beliefs. So they still, not through art, but just through history, we can kind of see that they still held on to these ideas about heaven and hell. They just weren't quite up for trying to, explain themselves through it. So, yeah, and they did occasionally paint pictures with religious elements. So that is the age of the isms. Alright, so the next era. We have modern art and Dada. Modern art. This is probably the craziest art movement to occur within all time. It was modern art. Modern art, similar to Romanticism, completely broke away from what art had meant up until the point at the beginning of the 20th century. Most specifically, Dada. Dada is fun to talk about. It didn't last very long, but it pretty much captures the whole modern art era. Dada broke into many different forms of, there was many different forms of art with performance, poetry, photography, sculpture, painting, collage. Dada abandoned the need for aesthetically pleasing art and focused on making works that generated questions about society as a whole and the role of the artist. Now, again, like Romanticism, however, spirituality and religion they didn't quite find their place in this movement. However, as members who took part in it literally questioned all norms, which included religion. So, yeah. It's hard to figure out what a typical Dadaist would think about life after death, as many of them, it's kind of sad, but a lot of them committed suicide in explaining or expressing themselves as that was like the highest level of being a Dadaist. It was like performing art. It's totally against norms and the ultimate self-expression. That part was kind of weird, but the Dada was short-lived and not much really came out of this time period. So the afterlife is kind of, I think Dadaists probably lived more because they thought the afterlife would be more interesting, I guess, than this life. So I think they were looking forward to the afterlife, or what they thought was going to be in the afterlife. Alright. Now we get to our final segment, postmodern and surrealism. So born out of the period of the Dadaist and was an opposition, an inverse of the radical ideas of Dada art. Surrealism focused on the deep subconscious mind, thought by rejecting Dada rational ideas. They thought that by rejecting Dada rational ideas, they could bring about a superior art in other works. In the Surrealist Manifesto, the movement was described as a pure state of mind that allows someone to express thoughts freely without encumbrance of rational thought and societal rules. Can you? No. So that people were able to express their thoughts freely without encumbrance of rational thought and societal rules. They wanted art that made the viewer think, so there's no solid answer to anything, which is sometimes frustrating. And this art focused a lot on dream imagery, and dream imagery is like, that's when you just throw physics out the window and you just start floating around, because that's what you feel like when you read. That's how I feel when I look at Dada art. So, not Dada art, surrealism. Surrealism, probably my favorite painting in this entire project, it's actually the screensaver of my laptop now, is Through the Afterlife by James McCarthy. And it's just the way that surrealists were able to imagine the afterlife and then express it as a dream. So they didn't have to follow any rules of what would normally be. It's like a completely different world that they were able to draw. Oh, I just love the painting. Okay. So the afterlife was, for a lot of surrealists, it was like this dream state. It was just gonna be like filled with wonder and amazement, and they just thought it'd be all shiny everywhere and beautiful. So that's how they thought about the afterlife. And yeah, all right. So this has been my final project for Principles of Art.